"Ma'am, you don't belong in that seat." The words didn't shout, but they cut through the low hum of the diner like a blade through warm butter, and for a second, even the coffee machine seemed to pause mid-breath as every fork, every whispered conversation, every glance slowly tilted toward the corner booth where Evelyn Carter sat with both hands wrapped around a chipped white mug, the steam curling upward in soft ribbons that blurred the overhead neon lights into something gentler than they really were, something kinder than the room felt in that moment. She didn't move right away, not because she hadn't heard, but because she had, and she was deciding how much of herself she was willing to give to a moment that had already taken too much, her back straight but not stiff, her shoulders relaxed in the way only someone who had lived through harder days could manage, her gray curls catching the light as she lifted her eyes slowly, meeting the figure standing beside her table, a uniform pressed too sharp, a presence that leaned more on authority than respect. And still she said nothing at first, just breathed, just held the warmth of the mug like it was something real in a world that was suddenly tilting cold. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past the window, tires whispering over asphalt, the morning sun stretching thin gold lines across the glass. And inside, a spoon slipped from someone's hand and clinked too loudly against a plate, the sound echoing in the silence that followed as if the room itself was waiting to see what she would do, what she would say, whether she would stand or shrink or disappear the way people expected her to. But Evelyn Carter had never been the kind of woman who disappeared. Not when her husband passed with hospital bills stacked like unread letters. Not when she worked double shifts at 68 just to keep the lights on in a small house that still smelled faintly of Sunday dinners and old hymns. Not when she quietly paid for a stranger's breakfast just minutes ago without asking for thanks. Because kindness, to her, wasn't something you performed, it was something you carried, even when it weighed heavy. She set the mug down gently, the ceramic touching the table with a soft, deliberate sound, her fingers lingering on the rim as if grounding herself in something steady, something certain, before she spoke in a voice that didn't rise, didn't tremble, didn't fight, but simply existed with a quiet kind of strength that didn't ask for permission. "I'm just having my coffee," she said, and the words hung there, simple, unarmed, yet somehow heavier than anything else in the room, because they weren't just about a seat or a table or a diner on a Tuesday morning. They were about presence, about dignity, about the quiet refusal to be erased. And for a brief moment, the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the pause before a storm or the stillness before something changes in a way no one can take back. And though no one knew it yet, not the waitress frozen near the counter, not the man pretending to read his newspaper, not even the figure standing over her with expectation tightening his jaw, something had already begun to turn, something slow and inevitable, like a door that had been closed for too long finally starting to open. The vinyl seat beneath Evelyn Carter creaked softly as she shifted just enough to ease the ache in her lower back, a quiet reminder of years that had not been gentle but had taught her how to endure without complaint. And as the man beside her table remained standing, waiting for something more than what she had given, she reached for the small sugar jar and twisted it open with steady hands, pouring a careful stream into her coffee, as if the simple act itself carried more meaning than any argument could, the grains dissolving slowly into the dark surface while the light above flickered once, twice, casting brief shadows across her face that revealed the fine lines carved by time and patience rather than bitterness. She had learned long ago that the world did not always reward softness, but it revealed truth through it, and truth, once seen, could not be unseen, even by those who tried to look away. A waitress near the counter, no older than 20, stood frozen with a half-filled glass of orange juice in her hand, her eyes darting between Evelyn and the uniformed figure, as if searching for permission to breathe again, while a man in a booth by the window folded his newspaper without reading a word, his fingers lingering on the edge of the page, unsure whether to intervene or remain safely invisible, because moments like this had a way of exposing more than they intended, not just about the people involved, but about everyone who witnessed them. Evelyn lifted her cup and took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through her chest in a way that felt grounding, almost defiant in its normalcy. And when she set it back down, she noticed a faint tremor in her fingers, not from fear but from the quiet exhaustion of carrying dignity in spaces that did not always welcome it. Yet she did not hide it, because she had nothing left to prove, not at her age, not after everything she had already survived. Her mind drifted, just for a second, to a small kitchen years ago, where her son sat at a worn wooden table doing homework under a dim lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration while she corrected his spelling with gentle patience, reminding him that words mattered, that how you said something could shape how it was heard, and that lesson had stayed with her, carried forward into every conversation, every silence, every moment where choosing calm over reaction felt like the harder path, but the right one all the same. She blinked once and returned to the present, the diner pressing back into focus with the clatter of dishes resuming faintly in the background, as if the world was trying to pretend it had not paused at all. But the air remained thick, charged with something unspoken, something waiting, and even the sunlight filtering through the window seemed to hesitate on the glass before reaching her table, catching the edge of her cup and reflecting a thin line of gold across the surface like a quiet reminder that light, no matter how faint, still found its way in. She rested her hands on the table now, palms down, grounding herself in the solid wood beneath her fingertips, and lifted her gaze again, not in challenge, not in defiance, but in presence, a steady, unwavering acknowledgement that she was here, that she had every right to be here, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was simply refuse to move when the world expected them to disappear. Deputy Mark Reynolds did not sit, did not soften, did not step back. Instead, he let the silence stretch just long enough to make his presence feel larger than the room itself, his shadow cutting across the edge of Evelyn's table as the overhead light hummed faintly above them. And there was something in the way he held his posture, rigid but not composed, that suggested this moment was not only about her seat or her coffee, but about something deeper he was trying to assert, something he needed others to see, because power, when it depends on being noticed, often grows louder in quiet rooms. His eyes moved briefly around the diner, catching the lowered gazes, the hesitant stillness of the people watching, and for a second his jaw tightened, as if he was measuring the weight of their attention, deciding how far he could go before it shifted against him. But no one spoke, no one interrupted, and that silence seemed to give him permission he had not yet earned. "I said you need to move," he repeated, his voice firmer now, not raised but sharpened, each word placed carefully like it was meant to land heavier the second time. And still Evelyn did not react the way he expected. She did not shrink, did not rush, did not argue. She simply looked at him again with the same steady calm, the kind that does not challenge but does not yield either, and that unsettled him more than resistance ever could, because there was no confrontation to push against, no anger to justify his own, only quiet dignity that refused to be bent into something smaller. A clock on the wall ticked loudly enough now to be noticed, each second stretching longer than the last, and somewhere behind the counter a coffee pot clicked off with a dull sound that echoed through the space, like a signal no one quite understood, while the young waitress finally set the glass of orange juice down with trembling fingers, the liquid inside rippling slightly as it touched the surface, mirroring the tension that had begun to spread through the room. Reynolds shifted his weight, one hand resting near his belt, not aggressively but deliberately, a subtle reminder of the authority he carried. And yet there was something uncertain beneath it, something that flickered in the brief pause before he spoke again, because Evelyn's stillness had created a kind of mirror he had not expected to face, one that did not reflect fear or submission but something far more difficult to control. Evelyn noticed it, not in his words but in the space between them, and she breathed in slowly, the scent of coffee and warm syrup filling her lungs as she grounded herself once more. Her voice, when it came soft but clear, "I have not done anything wrong," she said, not as a defense but as a simple truth, and the sentence settled into the room like a weight no one could easily lift, because it did not accuse, it did not provoke, it simply existed, undeniable in its simplicity. For a brief moment, the sunlight shifted again, breaking through the window at a sharper angle, catching the silver in her hair and illuminating her face in a quiet glow that contrasted the tension surrounding her. And in that light, she did not look small or out of place. She looked exactly where she was meant to be, a woman sitting at a table, holding on to her dignity with both hands, while across from her stood a man who was beginning to realize that control, once questioned by calm, does not return as easily as it was assumed. Reynolds let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a sigh, not quite patience, but something closer to irritation wrapped in control, and he leaned forward just enough for his shadow to fall fully across Evelyn's cup, dimming the thin line of sunlight that had rested there moments before, as if even the light had to step aside to make room for him. And the movement drew a quiet shift in the room, chairs creaking slightly, a fork tapping once against a plate before going still again. While somewhere near the register the bell above the door gave a soft jingle as a new customer stepped in, only to pause immediately, sensing the tension without needing to understand it. Evelyn noticed the shadow first, not the man, just the absence of light where it had been, and for a second, her fingers hovered over the edge of the cup as if remembering something distant, something older than this moment, a time when she had learned that darkness often arrived not with noise, but with presence, with someone standing just close enough to take something small and turn it into something heavy. But she did not pull her hand away. She let it rest there, steady, as if refusing to let even that small comfort be taken from her. "You are causing a disturbance," Reynolds said, his tone now carrying a practiced authority, the kind that sounded official even when it leaned on assumption, and his eyes flicked again toward the others in the diner, checking, measuring, confirming that no one had stepped forward, that the silence still held, because silence, when it stays too long, can start to feel like agreement. The young waitress swallowed hard and took a step forward before stopping herself, her hand gripping the edge of the counter as if it might anchor her in place, while the man by the window cleared his throat quietly but said nothing, his gaze dropping back to the folded newspaper in his hands. Because sometimes people did not choose sides, they chose distance, believing it would keep them safe from whatever came next. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her breath soft but deliberate, and she turned her head just slightly, enough to see the room without losing sight of the man beside her, her eyes moving across faces that avoided hers, across small signs of discomfort that filled the space but did not yet change it. And then she looked back at Reynolds, not with challenge, not with fear, but with a quiet understanding that seemed to reach beyond the moment itself, as if she had seen this pattern before, in different rooms, with different voices, wearing different uniforms but carrying the same expectation. "I am sitting at a table, drinking coffee I paid for," she said, each word measured, not rushed, not sharpened, simply placed where it belonged, and the sentence did not rise in volume, but it expanded in weight, settling into the room in a way that made it harder to ignore, because it did not argue with him. It revealed something simpler than his claim, something that did not need authority to exist. Reynolds's jaw tightened again, and for a brief second his hand flexed at his side, not in action but in hesitation, as if the response he expected had not arrived, and he was left searching for another path forward, one that would restore the control he felt slipping. And in that small pause, something shifted, subtle but real, because control built on reaction begins to falter when it is met with calm, and calm, when it holds steady long enough, can begin to change the shape of a room. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the diner windows, rattling them faintly, and the sunlight flickered once more through the glass, breaking around Reynolds's shoulder and reaching Evelyn's table again in thin, fractured lines, not as strong as before, but still present, still finding a way. And she noticed it, not as a symbol, not as a sign, but simply as light returning. And she let her hand rest there beside it, unmoving, grounded, as if to say without words that she was not leaving, not this seat, not this moment, not herself. The air in the diner tightened in a way that could not be measured but could be felt, like the moment before a storm when everything looks the same but nothing feels the same, and Reynolds seemed to sense it too, his posture shifting not with ease but with pressure, as if the calm in front of him had begun to press back in ways he had not anticipated, and he took a small step closer to the table, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to make his presence unavoidable, enough to remind everyone watching that he still believed he controlled how this moment would end. "Last warning," he said, the words coming out slower now, heavier, as though each one had to carry more weight than the last to achieve the same effect. But the room did not respond the way he expected, the silence no longer empty, but filled with something quieter, something watching, something waiting. Evelyn did not move, not her hands, not her shoulders, not even her gaze, which remained steady in a way that was not stubborn but resolved, as if she had already made her decision long before he ever walked up to her table. And the stillness of her presence began to ripple outward, touching the edges of the room in ways that made people shift in their seats, not from fear, but from awareness. The man by the window finally lifted his eyes again, this time not to look away, but to look directly at the scene unfolding, his fingers loosening slightly on the newspaper as though he was reconsidering something he had already decided. While the young waitress took another step forward, her breath shallow but determined, the glass she had set down now forgotten as her hands hovered uncertainly at her sides, caught between hesitation and the pull of something that felt more important than staying quiet. Reynolds noticed it, the change, small but unmistakable, and his eyes flicked across the room once more, not searching now but checking, and what he saw was not support, not agreement, but a growing discomfort that no longer hid itself as easily. And for a brief second something in his expression faltered, a crack so slight it could have been missed if not for the way it shifted the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders seemed to stiffen not with confidence but with resistance. Evelyn's voice came again, softer this time, but somehow clearer, cutting through the air without force. "I am not leaving," she said, and the sentence did not rise, did not push. It simply settled, firm and complete. And in that moment it carried more authority than anything else in the room, because it came not from position but from certainty. Outside, a car passed slowly, its reflection sliding across the diner window like a moving shadow, and the bell above the door gave another faint chime as it swayed from the earlier movement, the sound lingering just long enough to remind everyone that the world beyond these walls continued, unaware, unchanged, while inside something far more personal was shifting, something that could not be undone once it crossed a certain point. Reynolds straightened slightly, his hand moving, as if to gesture, to assert, to reclaim the space that had begun to slip from him. But the motion paused halfway, suspended in uncertainty, because for the first time since he had approached the table, he was no longer dictating the rhythm of the moment, and that realization settled into him slowly, like a weight he had not expected to carry. Evelyn remained where she was, her hands resting quietly on the table, her cup untouched now but still warm, and the light that had returned earlier stretched a little farther across the surface, catching the edge of her fingers in a soft glow that contrasted everything else in the room. And she did not look at it, did not acknowledge it. She simply stayed, grounded in a way that made leaving impossible not because she could not, but because she chose not to, and that choice, quiet as it was, began to change everything. The room did not explode into noise. It folded into something quieter, heavier, like the kind of silence that settles after a truth has been spoken and no one knows how to answer it. And for the first time since he had stepped up to the table, Reynolds did not immediately respond, his presence still there, but no longer expanding, no longer filling every corner of the diner the way it had before. Instead it hovered, uncertain, as if the ground beneath it had shifted just enough to make standing feel different. Evelyn noticed the change not through anything he said but through what he did not say, the absence of immediate control, the pause that lingered just a second too long, and she let that moment breathe, her chest rising slowly, falling just as steady, the rhythm of it grounding her in a way that no outside force could interrupt. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder again, each second marking the stretch of time that now belonged to no one in particular, and the sunlight, thin but persistent, continued to rest across her hands, warming her skin in contrast to the cool tension in the air. A chair shifted somewhere behind her, the scrape soft but noticeable, and the young waitress finally moved fully out from behind the counter, her steps cautious but real, each one closing the distance between watching and being present, while the man by the window set his newspaper down entirely now, both hands resting on the table as he leaned forward slightly, not speaking, not intervening, but no longer pretending not to see. Reynolds inhaled, a controlled breath, and his shoulders rose just enough to show the effort it took to hold himself together in a moment that no longer followed his lead. And when he spoke again, His voice was lower, not softer, but measured in a different way, as if he was choosing each word more carefully than before. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. And yet the statement did not land the same way his earlier words had. It did not carry the same weight, because the room had changed, and words that depend on control begin to weaken when control is no longer certain. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she had heard versions of that sentence her entire life, and her eyes held a depth that did not argue, but understood. A recognition of patterns that repeated themselves in different forms, but always carried the same expectation beneath them. And she let a small breath pass her lips before speaking again. "No, sir," she said, her tone even, respectful, but unwavering. "It is already complicated," and the truth of it settled into the space between them, not sharp, not confrontational, but undeniable, because it spoke to something larger than the moment, something that could not be simplified by authority or dismissed by discomfort. Outside, the wind quieted, the earlier rattle of the windows fading into stillness, and inside, the light shifted once more, spreading a little farther. Across the table, touching the edge of the sugar jar, the rim of the cup, the tips of her fingers, and she did not move away from it. She stayed exactly where she was, her presence steady, her silence now as powerful as her words had been, and in that stillness, something began to turn, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, like a tide changing direction beneath the surface, unseen by some, felt by others, and impossible to stop once it had begun. The bell above the diner door rang again, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clear, clean chime that cut through the tension in a way nothing else had, and for a moment no one turned, not immediately, as if the room had learned to move slower now, to process each shift with caution. But then the sound of measured footsteps followed, steady against the tiled floor, deliberate without urgency, and something about that rhythm drew attention without asking for it. Evelyn did not look right away, her hands still resting on the table, her posture unchanged, but her eyes softened just slightly, not with relief, not yet, but with recognition of something familiar entering the space, something she did not need to see to understand. Reynolds, however, turned quickly, almost instinctively, as if the break in the moment offered him something to reclaim, and his gaze landed on the man who had just stepped inside, a tall figure in a dark suit that contrasted quietly with the casual setting, his coat draped neatly over one arm, his expression composed in a way that did not demand attention but held it anyway. The man paused just inside the doorway, taking in the room with a single, sweeping glance, not hurried, not distracted, but focused, his eyes moving from the counter to the tables, to the faces that had gone still, and finally to the corner booth where Evelyn sat. And in that brief second, something passed across his face, not shock, not anger, but a controlled stillness that settled deeper than either. He began to walk forward, each step even, unforced, the soft sound of his shoes against the floor marking a new rhythm in the room, one that did not match the tension but did not avoid it either. And as he moved closer, the space seemed to adjust around him, not in deference, but in awareness, as if the presence he carried was not loud but undeniable. The young waitress stepped back slightly to make room without realizing she had moved, and the man by the window straightened in his seat, his attention fully fixed now, because something in the air had shifted again, not with pressure this time, but with clarity. Reynolds squared his shoulders, turning fully to face the approaching figure, and there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, faint but present, the kind that does not fully form until it is too late to ignore, and his stance adjusted, subtle but real, as if recalibrating in response to something he had not expected to encounter here, in this place, at this moment. The man stopped a few feet from the table, close enough now for the details to settle into focus, the clean lines of his suit, the quiet authority in the way he held himself, the calm that did not need to assert itself to be felt, and he did not speak right away, did not interrupt, did not rush to claim the moment. Instead, he looked at Evelyn first, his gaze softening just enough to acknowledge her presence fully, not as a situation, not as a problem, but as a person, and in that look there was history, there was understanding, There was something deeper than the room could see. Evelyn finally turned her head, meeting his eyes, and for the first time since the tension began, something in her expression shifted, not her posture, not her strength, but a quiet warmth that surfaced beneath it, subtle and steady, like a light that had always been there but had not yet been needed. Reynolds cleared his throat, the sound sharper than intended, and stepped slightly forward, attempting to reclaim the structure of the moment. But the balance had already begun to change, not dramatically, not visibly to all, but undeniably, because the presence that had just entered the diner did not raise its voice, did not challenge, did not demand. It simply stood there, grounded, composed, and in doing so, it altered the weight of everything around it, shifting the center of the room in a way that no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel. The space between words stretched thinner now, almost fragile, as the man in the suit finally shifted his attention from Evelyn to Reynolds. And though he had not yet spoken, something in the way he stood, balanced and unhurried, carried a kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. It simply existed, and that alone began to settle over the room like a quiet recalibration. Reynolds straightened, his posture sharpening as if pulled by instinct, and for the first time his voice did not come immediately, did not rise to fill the silence, because recognition had fully reached him now, not just of the man standing in front of him, but of what that presence meant, what it could change, and what it might reveal. The man took one more step forward, closing the distance just enough to stand beside Evelyn's table, not in front of her, not over her, but beside her, and that placement alone spoke volumes, a quiet alignment that did not need explanation. He set his coat gently over the back of an empty chair, the fabric falling neatly into place, and only then did he speak, his voice calm, measured, carrying the kind of clarity that did not depend on volume to be heard. "Is there a reason my mother is being asked to leave?" And the sentence landed clean, not aggressive, not defensive, but precise, each word placed exactly where it belonged, leaving no space for misunderstanding. The room seemed to inhale collectively, the weight of the question settling across every surface, every face, and Reynolds blinked once, a small, almost imperceptible delay that revealed more than any reaction could, because the certainty he had carried before was no longer intact. It had shifted, cracked just enough to let something else in. "She is refusing to comply," Reynolds replied, his tone still controlled but now threaded with something less certain, something that searched for footing, and as he spoke, his gaze flickered briefly toward Evelyn before returning to the man, as if the presence beside her had redefined where his attention needed to be. The man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, absorbing the words, without reacting to them immediately. And when he responded, it was not with escalation, not with force, but with quiet clarity. "Comply with what?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, carried a weight that pressed deeper than accusation, because it required an answer that could stand on its own, not on assumption, not on authority, but on truth. Reynolds's jaw tightened again, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath, the ticking clock loud in the background, the faint hum of the lights returning to awareness. And somewhere near the counter the young waitress clasped her hands together, her fingers intertwining as if holding on to something she could not yet name. Evelyn remained still, her hands resting gently on the table, her gaze lowered now not in submission but in calm, as if she had stepped back from the center of the moment and allowed it to unfold on its own, trusting something larger than the tension that had filled it before. The man beside her glanced down briefly, his eyes softening as they met her presence again, and there was a quiet exchange there, unspoken but understood, a reassurance that did not need words, before he looked back at Reynolds, steady, grounded, unchanged. Outside, the sunlight shifted once more, breaking fully through the window now, spreading across the diner floor in a wider glow that reached farther than before, touching the edges of tables, the legs of chairs, the shoes of those standing still. And as it reached Evelyn's table again, it seemed brighter, clearer, no longer fractured, as if something in the room had allowed it to pass through without resistance. And in that light, the balance had fully turned, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. leaving Reynolds standing in a moment that no longer belonged to him the way it had just minutes before. Reynolds opened his mouth as if to respond, but the words did not come as easily now, not with the same certainty, not with the same weight, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, filled with the presence of truth waiting to be acknowledged, and for a moment he stood there, caught between what he had assumed and what now stood plainly in front of him, unable to move forward without stepping into something he could not control. The man beside Evelyn did not rush him, did not press. He simply waited, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, allowing the space to settle into something honest, something that did not rely on force to be recognized. And in that stillness, the question remained, simple, direct, unavoidable. The ticking clock marked another second, then another, and somewhere behind them a coffee machine hissed softly, as if reminding the room that life continued even in moments like this. But no one moved to resume it. No one spoke, because something deeper had taken hold, something that demanded attention without asking for it. Reynolds finally exhaled, the breath longer than intended, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not entirely, but enough to be heard differently. "There was a complaint," he said, the words less sharp now, less certain, and as they left him, they seemed to lose shape in the air, because they no longer stood on solid ground. They hovered, unsupported, and even he seemed to feel it. The man nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he had expected no more and no less. And he turned slightly toward Evelyn, his hand resting gently on the back of the chair beside her, not touching her, not interrupting her space, but close enough to be felt, a quiet presence that did not overshadow but supported. Evelyn lifted her eyes to him again, and in that look there was no triumph, no sense of victory, only a calm understanding that the moment had reached its natural end, not through force, but through truth finding its place, and she gave the smallest nod, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed, but it carried everything that needed to be said. The young waitress took a breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders lowering as tension left her body, and the man by the window leaned back slightly in his seat, his hands relaxing on the table as if something inside him had settled as well, something that had been waiting for this exact shift. Reynolds stepped back then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just one step, but it changed the space entirely, opening it, releasing it, and the weight that had filled the diner began to lift, slowly, like a storm passing without ever breaking, leaving behind an air that felt clearer, easier to breathe. Outside, the sunlight now streamed fully through the windows, stretching across the floor, across the tables, across Evelyn's hands as they rested quietly beside her cup, and she looked down at them for a moment, at the light warming her skin, and then back up, her expression unchanged but softer, as if something had been confirmed rather than won. The man beside her reached for his coat, lifting it from the chair with a smooth motion, and for a brief second he paused, looking around the diner, not at any one person, but at the room as a whole, as if taking in the moment in its entirety, before turning back to Evelyn. "Did you finish your coffee?" he asked gently, his voice no longer carrying the weight of the earlier exchange, but something lighter, something familiar, and she glanced at the cup, then back at him, a faint smile touching her lips as she shook her head slightly. "Not yet," she said, and the words, simple as they were, carried a quiet sense of continuity, of life moving forward, unchanged at its core. He nodded, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down without hesitation, as if this had always been the plan, as if nothing had interrupted it at all, and the room, slowly, began to return to itself, the clatter of dishes resuming, the murmur of voices rising again, but softer now, more aware, as though everyone present had witnessed something they would carry with them long after they left. Evelyn lifted her cup once more, the warmth still there, still steady, and as she took a small sip, the sunlight caught the edge of the ceramic, reflecting upward in a soft glow that lingered just a moment longer before settling back into the quiet rhythm of the day, where nothing looked different, but everything felt just a little more seen.